Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
It would be a strange person indeed, I think, or a peculiar genius who didn't feel humbled at appearing amongst the roll of so many distinguished recipients of this award. For many of us are, in the words of Bernard of Chartres, like dwarves perched on the shoulders of giants, and only thus able to see more and further than the latter, not at all because of the acuteness of our sight and the stature of our body, but because we are carried aloft and elevated by their magnitude. Never was this truer, I think, than in the case of Abbé Pierre. When he founded the first Emmaus community in 1949 in post-war Paris, he had no idea he was founding either a major social enterprise or an international movement. So far as he was concerned, he was simply responding to a shocking and unacceptable situation and doing what he felt was right and necessary. His experience as priest, resistance hero, and parliamentarian had molded him to fight injustice, and his activist nature was such that it had to be something practical. In his case, and with crucial input from the first 20 homeless and unemployed people with whom he shared his life and home, he began collecting donations of furniture, clothing, and household goods for sale in a large wooden shed erected in what had formerly been the presbytery garden. Other collected items like metal, rags, and paper were sorted, bundled, and recycled. The aim was to provide a home and a living for the companions, as the 20 were called, and to use any proceeds thereafter to help those worse off than themselves. This kind of thinking was so much a part of his nature and training, I think, that the originality of creating a charity that worked, restoring self-respect to those who had lost it by providing a supportive home and meaningful work, and in the process turning grudging receivers into motivated givers, barely occurred to him. Even the name he chose for the movement, Emmaus, taken from one of his favorite stories in the New Testament, when two disciples regained hope and purpose through an encounter with the risen Christ on the road to a small village called Emmaus, was intrinsic to his character and to his thinking. Today, the movement he created is one of the largest NGOs in France, second only in size to the Red Cross, and hugely important there in the provision of creative and practical solutions to the problem of homelessness. Today, worldwide, across 37 countries, there are 327 self-supporting communities and more than 440 partnership organizations. My own first encounter with Emmaus was in 1960 as a modern languages student in Cambridge. Abbé Pierre was a fervent internationalist who believed that by enabling students to travel and work together, he could do something practical to assist reconciliation in post-Second World War Europe. To this end, he used the Emmaus communities in Paris to invite university students from around Europe to spend their summer vacation working there alongside companions. For 3 months, I salvaged coal from cellars, cleared houses and apartments, tore papers, bundled rags. We were a pretty motley crew. With me were 2 other students, as well as around 20 French companions, a Benedictine worker priest, and the community leader. The companions came from every walk of life and every level of society. Many were alcoholics, nearly all ex-servicemen, a number had been in prison, 1 or 2 were redundant executives fallen on hard times. Nearly all had significant psychological problems or trauma to overcome. We worked in groups of 3, a driver, not always totally sober, and 2 companions. After 3 months, I returned to my studies, speaking a form of French that raised some eyebrows and suppressed smiles at my university oral examination. Thereafter, for the next 30 years, I got on with my career as an international marketing consultant and forgot about Emmaus until 1989, when homeless people started to appear on the streets of Cambridge. A local soup kitchen was set up, and because of my business background in market research, I was asked to explore fundraising for a night shelter. Talking to the homeless people living on the street and in the makeshift camp that they had set up by the river, I learnt about how they felt about night shelters. At that time, they were dreaded as places where you would be robbed whilst sleeping, even if you were able to do so, surrounded by sickness, drunkenness, and violence. A few days later, I was challenged by a very lucid but angry homeless man who shot down every fundraising idea I had in flames. And eventually I became so irritated I asked him what on earth he did want, as all I seemed to be hearing was what he didn't like. And his answer changed my life. I would have thought it obvious to someone of your so-called intelligence, he sneered. I want somewhere I can work, where I feel I belong, and where I can recover my self-respect. These last two words took me back those 30 years. I tried to buy time, because I knew I was lost, and told him about a French organization called Emmaus, which did just that, but that I had no idea if it still existed or not. His next remark put the seal on my fate. And what are you going to do about it? He asked. Emmaus UK was born. The next day I looked in the Paris telephone directory, contacted Abbé Pierre, enlisted his instant and enthusiastic support, and set about trying to set up an Emmaus community in the UK. 24 years later, in 2013, we were about to reach a key milestone of 25 Emmaus communities up and running in the UK, with a further 9 active development projects. Each has cost around £1.5 million to set up and fund until economic self-sufficiency is achieved. Our focus is primarily on communities and international solidarity rather than housing provision or political activism, which is a significant activity in France. Nevertheless, the UK is now the largest Emmaus movement outside France and the fastest growing. And independent external research has shown that for every £1 invested in an established community, £11 are generated in social, environmental, and economic returns. In 2012-2013 alone, the 21 Emmaus communities participating in this research saved the public purse an estimated £6 million. This equates to an average of £2.2 million per community for a non-trading investment of £198,000 each year. Our objective was to emulate Emmaus in France. To do this, we considered that around 100 communities would be necessary in the UK. That's some 30 fewer than in France, but roughly one in every conurbation. We hoped that Emmaus would rapidly become part of the infrastructure of every local community where it was present, and set this as a 10-year target. Without a charismatic national figure and a political heavyweight to lead us, it has been the hard slog of learning and relearning, one by one, the old lessons of business building. Only in this case, it is a social enterprise where the proponents of social values have often fought fiercely with those more interested in the values of enterprise. Our first discovery in the field of management was our own ignorance, and we had to learn a number of lessons and suffer the consequences of our own mistakes, as well as those of the people we were able to recruit. When we started, small charities found it hard to attract skilled managers. Indeed, we didn't seem to be alone in attracting some psychological casualties who were simply not robust enough to survive in the private sector, and whose needs often echoed those of the homeless people we were seeking to support. An additional complication was their ability to deploy behavioral systems to muddy the waters and protect themselves from accountable decision-taking. We learned that commercial disciplines and skills are not always transferable, and it has been a steep learning curve for us to attract and retain the quality of people we have in place today, able to reserve the often conflicting requirements of the social and the enterprise without lapsing into the protective cocoon of process bureaucracy. Falling between government agencies as we do, we've often failed to reconcile their own differing standards and internal requirements. More seriously, perhaps, we have also encountered government agencies seeking to exercise control through standards sometimes inappropriate to either their needs or ours. More dangerously, they sometimes have seemed to me to be used in such a way as to provide alibi documentation for avoiding decisions and passing the parcel. The second lesson we have learnt is the importance of time and perspective in healing damaged lives and minds. Repairing people's lives, helping the recovery of self-respect are not clear-cut tasks or a short-term or predictable business. And the idea that a formerly homeless person with all the complex psychological and social variables involved can be rehabilitated within a fixed time frame, as is in the case with social impact bonds, is frankly nonsense. Equally, if one has to deal with ministers and civil servants who have not been in post long enough to know their subject in depth, in a political environment that appears increasingly short-term and knee-jerk in its thinking, there are few grounds for hope in deploying common-sense solutions, even when cost-effectiveness and clear benefits can be demonstrated. It is perhaps significant to note in this context that even though some key ministers have remained in place during the current government's term in office, the churn of senior civil servants has been extremely high across Whitehall. Our third area of painful learning and discovery has been critical mass. Like the RSA, we seek to enrich society through ideas and action. The other hard lesson is that by and large, God still favours the big battalions. The bigger and better known you are, the more and better the people you attract. The fourth area of discovery and deception leads on from this. In funding, government rules are not commercial rules. It is clear that government cannot fund charities, but it seems equally clear to me that they should invest in cost-effective initiatives that save them money. You may recall that I said earlier that independent research, commissioned incidentally by ourselves and supported by the Pera Foundation, had demonstrated a return on government's own measure of social investment more than 11 times what it cost. A social and economic return of over £11 for every £1 invested. I know of no other enterprise, commercial or social, with such a return. So what is the point of social impact bonds, seemingly tailor-made for social enterprises like our own, requiring rehabilitation within a fixed time period, when our level of return on social investment is already satisfying government's own rigorous measure of cost effectiveness? And why, when this is pointed out, does an inappropriate measure continue to fly in the face of an equally robust standard? Another crucial element in critical mass and the big battalions is what it might enable us to do in the future. Many of you will be aware of the RSA's interest and involvement in trying to reduce the currently unacceptable levels of ex-prisoner reoffending. This is not a simple problem, I know. One thing, for instance, that I learnt during my service as a JP was that the current prevalence of releasing prisoners on licence after half or even less of the sentence imposed by the courts means that very little meaningful educational or remedial work of any kind can be undertaken in prisons. Indeed, whenever our particular bench visited prisons in the east of England, we were implored by prison staff to hand down the maximum sentences possible, not on the grounds of deterrence or punishment, but because we were told that nothing can be achieved in terms of altering behaviour or even improving or enabling reading or writing skills in less than 4 months. Now, if we have 100 Emmaus communities, we could both place more ex-offenders in locations nearer to their own homes and also fill their time with meaningful work and values. Street homelessness being what it is, you will understand that we have a fairly high proportion of companions who have served terms in prison and who can now act as positive agents for change as well. But of course, without a large number of communities, we would run the risk of simply creating a new form of open prison. I'm also aware that the numbers are so huge that this would only be one remedy among many, but there is a leverage factor there too, and it would work. Another area close to my heart is that of military veterans. I foresee a time when there will be a need to support veterans who've become homeless after discharge or redundancy through post-traumatic stress, difficulty in adjusting from service to civilian life, and a number of other related but specific causes. We already have around 10% of companions with a military background. Last, but by no means least, I think cooperation with the RSA on this and other matters, think youth unemployment, for example, could lead to a more fruitful relationship with government as well as industry. Say nothing of cost-effective solutions, critical mass but not partisan mass, symbiotic expertise, common values.
What happens if people don't live up to your expectations in Emmaus? Because this is a tough love approach, if you like. It's something which is, it's not something for nothing, it's something for something.
Well, Abbé Pierre was always insistent on that. He said, in the words certainly of his Catholic faith, reminded us of the forgiveness is not a 7 times business, it is a 70 times 7, because learning is a very long-term, sometimes a constrained purpose. We have somebody in the first community now, in Cambridge, who took 20 years to get his head around himself, but the work he's doing now is worth every one of those things. We are insistent that if somebody robs a community or something like that, they answer to the law, they do whatever they have to do, but then they can come back.
Listening to your speech, actually the people that you deal with, the homelessness is merely the symptom of the problem. The problem is that they've come out of the armed forces without a sense of what to do next, or skills, or they've been traumatized by their experience, drug or alcohol addiction, mental health. Do you think it's useful to talk about homelessness as the problem when in fact it is nearly always a symptom of some other problem?
I think street homelessness is an end result of a number of things. And actually, the most common military example I know is that a guy will come out of the services having done his 16 years or had to leave for medical reasons, and his wife has not been used to seeing him for more than 3 months of every year for the past 16 years, and he goes home and he's around a great deal more than he ever was, and a marriage, might start creaking. He could well be made redundant. Generally speaking, military people of that nature would say, right, well, you have the house, I'll go and find lodgings and do something. Then he's made redundant. He gets into the no address, no job, no address symbol, and he gets down onto the street. It's that sort of event, marriages breaking up. So homelessness can come through one of really quite a wide number of things. Yes, there are other symptoms of people having, as it were, fallen through or below the net. But street homelessness is a particularly savage manifestation.
What do you think is happening to our attitudes to the most disadvantaged in society? There is a strong view now that we are becoming harsher in our view, that we, 25, 30 years ago, unemployment seemed to be a problem of the labour market. We now assume it's a problem of the unemployed, for example. Do you sense a harshening in our attitude, or is it the reverse? Is it that in a sense we are realising that we need a welfare state which has this kind of rigour that you have in your process, that just kind of trying to help people without demanding anything back never worked?
My personal view, but it is a personal view, is that with the decline of religious values with a small r, there's a sort of latent NIMBYism that has grown, and it has become, in many senses, a more selfish world, possibly because the extremes of hardship and affluence have widened, or the gap between them. I mean, it's a constant source of surprise to me. I spent 6 months in the United States about 15 years ago, and I was in a company trying to turn it round, and Emmaus was just starting. And this is a country, the richest country in the world, with 25% of its population living below the poverty line. And there was my entire department, which would have, I think, frankly, if I'd done it, resigned the day after to start an Emmaus community, because it engaged people's value system. And I think in one sense, it is perhaps a bastion among the people of many faiths and none who work with us at the moment, that this is actually a return to, what is decent, true and honest, to use the advertising standards go.